And because it is a week for God, this is what Schroeder says, 7 literal 24-hour days for him in his chosen frame of reference. But from our earthly perspective that looks back in time, this is stretched out to billions of years. This is a concept that any physicist who understands relativity has to acknowledge as a possibility.
Sarah Salviander is on my podcast. I'm going to try not to be too much of a fanboy and embarrass myself. But when I first discovered, when I first heard you use the name Gerald Schroeder, I was like, because I've been a fan of Gerald Schroeder's books for years and years and years. And the fact that you are an astrophysicist who was touting what seemed to me to be a very reasonable, I'm not an astrophysicist, but I read Gerald's Science of God book, and I felt like I almost understood what he was talking about.
Excellent. That's the highest praise you can give.
Yeah.
Almost understood.
Well, that's how I felt. And so when you, as somebody with a much higher level of expertise on the subject that he was talking about, came along and said that it was influential in your faith, it basically affirmed me. It's all about me, really, anyway.
Of course, yes.
So I just wanted to get from you this sort of an idea of how Gerald Schroeder is regarded in the scientific community, because I know nothing about it. Is he ignored? Is he renowned? Is he lambasted and persecuted? Is he unknown? I mean, what happens with him?
I would say mostly unknown, and there have been a couple of atheist scientists who have criticized him. There's a late professor of mathematics named Mark Perils who wrote this detailed critique. But what I noticed is that he mostly just criticizes really insignificant little errors in the science of God, some of which are valid. And I was in communication with Dr. Schroeder for a long time, and he said, yeah, stupid mistakes. A lot of them aren't, but he never criticized really the substance of Schroeder's argument, especially the time dilation one. He never got to that. So what he was trying to do was say, see these silly errors that this physicist was making. Now, do you trust anything else he says?
Right.
And it was, to me, it was kind of a sneaky thing to do, you know?
Right. To basically try to discredit the whole work as a result of some other less important errors.
Very minor errors. I'll give you an example of something that's not an error, but the way that Dr. Schroeder uses the word heat. It has a very specific meaning in physics, but Dr. Schroeder used it in more of a colloquial layperson sort of way. And so Dr. Perils would say, well, he doesn't understand the concept of heat. Can you trust anything he says? And it's so silly. You know, right. He's using it in an everyday sort of way that people can relate to.
Right. Well,
So,
that's the challenge, I think, is when you're trying to communicate something as complicated as time dilation to people who don't understand anything about physics.
Right.
You're going to have to you're going to have to dumb it down, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely you have to, because if you don't, and for the sake of being very technically oriented, you're going to lose a lot of people.
Right.
It's so not the point.
Right. Well, and I will confess that I skipped over all the math in that book. I skipped it all.
Okay, and that's fine. I worked through the math several times, and it is correct. You know, you can quibble about the details of the numbers that you put in, but the math itself is fine.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you to articulate in layman's terms, from your perspective, what it is that Gerald Schroeder is communicating with that time dilation theory, because I think I understand what he's saying, but I want to hear, without biasing you, I want to hear what it means.
Let me think of a succinct way. There's this sense that God has his work week. And from what I understand, having read ancient Near East scholarship, this is a response to the Babylonian 7-day work week. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, well, here's God's work week, right? And because it is a week for God, this is what Schroeder says, 7 literal 24-hour days for him in his chosen frame of reference. But from our earthly perspective that looks back in time, this is stretched out to billions of years, okay? It is literally days and billions of years at the same time. And this is a concept that any physicist who understands relativity has to acknowledge as a possibility. Now, why God would have chosen for it to appear to be billions of years for us, I don't know. But there it is. I mean, does that kind of jibe with your understanding of it?
Yeah, the way my understanding of it was that basically there's been this hang up in Christendom, this fiery debate about whether creation was a literal 24-hour, 7-day week, or whether it was epochs or a longer period of time represented in that word yom, which
right.
they translated today. And basically Schroeder, well, the whole book, The Science of God, is basically predicated on the premise that there does not have to be a battle between science and religion, that there, specifically the Bible, that there's no war going on.
Correct.
And the version that I read of his book, I think it's been reprinted, but the version that I had was an early version that had that chapter towards the end. So it was like kind of the big lead up to that. And he was saying, in essence, that 14 billion year old universe and a literal 6-day creation are the same period of time.
Yes.
They're not incompatible. It's not either or. They're talking about the same period of time.
They are indeed. Yeah. There's no war. They're compatible. Exactly. And so I had come to this from a non-religious perspective, and it made sense to me as a physicist. And thus, that was my introduction to the Bible.
Right. Okay. So you, contrary to what can be read about Sarah Salviander online, that you were not this posing atheist. You were not pretending to be a non-believer who was then is kind of, hey, here's this Gerald Schroeder character. I can hitch my wagon to this and pretend like, that this all justify all of my superstitious religious beliefs with science.
Right. That was kind of shocking to me when people started accusing me of that. And
yeah.
I didn't know this was a thing that you could accuse somebody of being a fake atheist, because to me, actually, I'm mildly embarrassed by my background. I was raised totally atheist by atheist parents. They were ex-Catholics. They were socialists. They moved us to a socialist country so we could live the dream. I was raised, and by the time I was in my early 20s, I was a confirmed anti-theist. I mean, I was actually a Christian hater, and had softened by the time I moved back to the US, and just kind of had my religious awakening moment in the middle of a research program. And then I found Schroeder's book, and then the whole journey to the Bible. But yeah, I mean, I do not brag about being an ex-atheist. It's a little embarrassing to me, actually.
Well, my first interaction, I first discovered you on Twitter, and I started following you on Twitter because of the interactions that you had with atheists online, and they're so entertaining. I'll put all of your stuff up so that anybody that's listening to this can go and follow you. But what I like about the way you interact with the atheists is that you are you're not unkind, but you're not gentle with them either. And that is I think necessary, because the culture war, I've been doing battle, I suppose, with atheists for a number of years, less so of recently than previously, than 6 or 8 years ago. And that was what I wanted to ask, was this new atheism thing that was kind of all the rage, and all the atheists were coming out of the woodwork. They were having like Atheist Day. Did you know there's an Atheist Day?
No.
It's March 23rd. I don't know who set it up. I don't know who determined March 23rd is Atheist Day, but that's the day you're supposed to come out as an atheist.
Oh, I see.
Like you make the big reveal that you have no belief in God, and that's, but there was this whole movement about atheism that was, and people were proud of it. People were identifying as that was enlightened, and I don't know if that is still the case. I don't know if I haven't heard, except for a very small, fringy sort of groups on Facebook and so on. I haven't heard a whole lot about atheists, and I just wondered if you think that what happened to that movement? I mean, what? I
think it fizzled. So if you're tying it kind of to the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, that seems to have crescendoed and died off. And I think the only person who's still kind of relevant is Sam Harris, but he's changed his focus quite a bit. I don't think it got a little bit of momentum going, and then it just fizzled because there wasn't a lot of intellect behind it. There wasn't a lot of substance.
Right.
It was more of they were reacting to something at the time, the zeitgeist, it's over, and now we're kind of firmly in the age of postmodernism where they can't even pretend to be logic and science oriented. Now it's all about creating your own truth,
right,
which is not compatible with that style of atheism.
Right.
So I think it's dead, effectively.
You think it's dead? Yeah. Well, so it was, you said something about it not having any substance and being intellectually void.
Yes.
And that was the thing that I kept finding myself saying to them. I wasn't trying to undercut them, and I wasn't trying to insult them. I was saying, look, I genuinely don't see any substance here. And then they would even admit it themselves. They would say atheism is not a belief, it is a lack of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I had atheists telling me atheism is a void. It is content free. And I would say, well, then what are you writing about? What are we talking about if there's no content here?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's hard to organize people around a lack of something.
Right.
It's hard to write substantively about a lack of something. It's really kind of parasitic in that sense. And that if there was no such thing as religion, you wouldn't have these people.
Right.
It's not a positive thing in itself.
Right. Right. If there was no religion, that was the thing that the atheists would always demand. They would ask us to state something. We would have to put something on the table for them to basically be skeptical of.
Correct. Whereas without atheists, you would still have religious movements and religious people,
right,
because it is a positive thing. And I don't mean that in a value sort of way. I mean that it is something, you are for something, you believe positively in something,
Right. Right. You have to have something to talk about, and
correct.
And atheism doesn't. But so that being said, watching the time here, I wanted to ask you about the debate between science and religion from a Christian perspective, because I still have a lot of friends who haven't read Schroeder's book, and if they did read Schroeder's book, they would have anxiety because they genuinely believe that to have a scientific or rational reason for believing in God is to diminish your faith. You know what I'm saying?
I do. Yes.
And so, as a straight up legitimate scientists, you guys, I want to ask, what do we say to people who are still convinced that science and Christianity are at odds with each other, and they have to make a choice whether they're going to have faith in God or whether they're going to believe the scientific rationale for God's existence? And
are you thinking more from the Christian perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that has been kind of a tough nut for me to crack, because I can't relate to that, because I'm very dialectically oriented. I come from a data and reason side of things, and that led to very naturally for me to God. If there is an order, there has to be an orderer. And I found out much later in my Christian experience that a lot of Christians, it's all about the experience. It's all about your sort of emotional, relational connection to God, as opposed to this part of it, the intellect.
Right.
I'd say it has to be both. So I, if anything, have in years past erred too much on the other side, that it's very data driven and logical, and you test the claims of the Bible and they stand up and hooray, there's a God. But at some point you do have to just break down and realize that you have a relationship with God the Father. And it is very important that it also be the heart aspect of it. But I say it has to be both. And when it talks about in the New Testament, when you're exhorted to love God with your entire being, that includes your mind, right? He gave us the capacity to reason, I think, in order to understand God also on that level. It doesn't take away from the emotional, relational aspect. In fact, I think that it adds greatly to it. You do not have to choose. That is a lie. And I think that is a lie that has been promoted, especially by atheists, in order to get that wedge in there. That's a way to if I can, as an atheist, let's say I'm really hostile to Christianity and I want to put a wedge between Christians and God the Father, I'll look for any opening I can. You get in there and you start to pry, and that's one place to pry. And if you look at the data, if you look at where young Christians are losing their faith, a big part of it is that they do not see how it relates to the real world. And so it's been an effective technique, we have to be careful. I would say you need both. You need the head and the heart.
Yeah. Then that is a scientist.
Yes.
Talking.
Yes. But for me, like I said, the challenge has been to let go a little bit of that purely rational aspect to it, and just sometimes to experience him.
Yeah.
That can be equally difficult for some people.
Yeah. Well, I think it's difficult from the standpoint if you're trying to make a case for Christianity or a case for the existence of God to somebody who identifies as an atheist or a scientist, and they're always asking for empirical evidence. They're always asking for irrefutable scientific evidence. That I think it creates anxiety for Christians, because you start to feel dumb saying, well, I just experienced God. I talked to him. I had this moment where, whatever it is, you just feel dumb because that's not empirical evidence. And all you have to do is say, well, I just don't believe you.
Right. And they're going to throw up that objection every time. So no matter how much data and rational arguments I put out there, they'll still say, I'm not convinced.
Right.
That's not proof. They want to be coerced into believing, and that's not the way it works.
Yeah. Well,
so these Christians should know that even, a scientist who's supposedly, able to provide all these proofs, it's never enough. It's just never enough. If somebody's determined not to believe, they're going to find any reason not to believe.
That was my next question, is that you've gotten, I did a little research. I didn't do extensive research, but I found several places where you had been, you were the topic of conversation. Interestingly enough, you weren't actually part of the conversation, but you were the topic of the conversation.
Oh boy.
And what was interesting to me is I was listening to a couple of atheists talking on YouTube about you, and they had put up evidently a tweet that you had sent out a while back with your 5 reasons, or 5 of the reasons.
Oh yeah, that one kind of went viral.
So do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, they were talking about how your first thing was that Genesis is scientifically, or Genesis is consistent with science.
Yeah.
That's what they said. And first they acknowledged that you were, a straight up PhD and an astrophysicist and a scientist. And then they said, and she says that Genesis is consistent with science. And then the two of them proceeded to basically mock you for saying that. And I just,
standard.
But I just think it's so interesting that they will acknowledge your credentials as a scientist, and then just throw out everything you say about science being consistent with Genesis.
No, right. And so, they have, there is a problem with appeal to authority. That doesn't prove that I'm right. But for me, when I see somebody who has credentials and experience and they make a claim like that, I'm at least going to wonder why. I would pursue it, right? Okay, this person who's got some experience in the scientific realm, why is she saying this? You'd think that instead of just mockery, they would want to look into the details. Why?
Right.
But they don't. And it creates this cognitive dissonance sort of thing, and I've had people tell me, you should have your PhD taken back, and, all these little slams. They're really amusing. I started collecting them. But yeah,
you should lose your PhD in astrophysics because you believe God exists.
Yeah, well, then I'm sorry, you're going to have to take back PhDs of a lot of prominent scientists. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. But I don't take it personally. I find it very amusing.
Well, and that's apparent on your Twitter feed. Some of the stuff that some of the retorts that you have had for the atheists have been classic.
I've had fun. I got to admit, it's fun. I try not to revel in it too much, but it is amusing.
Well, yeah, that's a whole other conversation that we can have about the, whether or not you're supposed to enjoy being right about the
right.
about your theology.
Well, they provide their own comedy. It's just like, I can't help it. I'm just going to go with it. Yeah.
It writes itself.
Yes.
All right. I got one other thing I want to explore. The idea of being a smart Christian and some of the perils that go along with being a smart Christian. This is sort of kind of connected to the idea of knowing things, scientific things, reduces your faith or makes you less of a faithful Christian because you actually have a reason for believing something rather than just, I believe it because the Bible says.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel like, and I'm trying to get this from a church perspective,
okay,
Christian perspective, do you feel like there is there's sort of a nerd label that gets put on people who are scientific, intellectual, people who think about stuff, sometimes get labeled as the brainiacs or nerds or geeks because they know things.
Uh-huh.
And that all of that knowledge is it's kind of trivial, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really apply to faith. Am I making sense?
I'm trying to fully understand. So is it the idea that somehow having this geeky knowledge would diminish faith or trivialize it, or what?
I've had people argue with me, Christian people argue with me on one point or another. Sometimes it has to do with the age of the earth, for example.
Okay.
And they will say, because I will quote Schroeder. I'll say, I don't know everything about this, but here's a guy who does know about it, and this is kind of what he says. And the retort from Christians will be, well, I'm not interested. I'm only interested in what the Bible says. I'm only interested in what God says. I'm not interested in man-made logic or man-made reasoning.
I understand. I even had a fellow quote Paul, who had warned against vain philosophy.
Right.
And said that he interpreted that as meaning that all philosophy was vain,
Right.
Therefore. So it's that kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, it's the idea that if you come, I don't know how to say it, and it sounds a little arrogant the way I'm saying it, but if you have an intellectual argument for something, that doesn't count, because that's man-made logic, as if man created logic.
Right. As opposed to being, I always think of the book of John in the beginning, and how it parallels Genesis and talking about the logos, right? And of course he's the word, but it is related to the word logical. To me, it's saying that the rules of logic existed before the universe, right? I just see the connection there, that it should be rational. It should be of the mind. We were given rational minds by God. And if not to use them, then why?
Right.
Yeah, so now I struggle with that perspective, because no matter which way you approach it, and even for me with the data and the reason and all these things, it still leads right to the foot of the cross. And this is something man will never completely understand. And so all it's done for me, maybe compared with other people, is it's pushed back that mystery a few feet, relative to how much mystery is actually there. I mean, if anything, it increases my awe for God, because even with my silly credentials, I can understand certain things. But what I don't know, that realm of what I don't know, just gets bigger and bigger the more that I do learn. Yeah, I'm just absolutely in awe of this creation, of this world. No, it hasn't diminished it at all. If anything, I just feel like more of an idiot the more that I, pursue this kind of stuff, compared with God, right? With this vast intellect.
Right. Well, do you think that we have a problem, and I'm talking, I guess, as a larger culture now, in understanding the value of experts, in terms of, do you think we overemphasize experts' opinion, and simultaneously sort of undervalue them in certain cases? It seems like we get it out of balance. Like
I think so. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So in a sense, in terms of my expertise, it doesn't mean I'm smarter than anybody else. It doesn't mean I'm better than anyone else. What it means is that I have devoted a great deal of my time to systematically studying one aspect of nature, and therefore I understand it pretty well, and I can impart that knowledge to other people. That's my job. Whereas other people who are not in the sciences, they've got other things that they're doing with their time that are valuable. So this is a service that I provide. Now, it doesn't mean I'm infallible, but it does mean that I would hope somebody would take me seriously. But of course, you want to check everything that experts say. Does it pass the common sense test? Is it consistent with reality? Is it all kind of fitting together with what experts in other fields are talking about? There should be areas of overlap. So that it is a service, but at the same time, you're right that it kind of surprises me, not in a good way, when people are almost reverent of scientists.
Right.
Those 3 letters after your name, they don't mean as much as some people think they do.
Well, yeah, they mean something, but at the same time, I had a guy, we were going back and forth about morality. It always comes down to ethics and morality. That's okay. But we were talking about right and wrong, and how there's no basis for right and wrong if there's no God. I mean, the truth is rooted in the existence of God, and if you don't have God, then there's no right and wrong. And this guy said to me, he goes, "Well, I'm not qualified to talk about right and wrong or morality. You would have to consult an expert on morality."
Oh no! No! Oh no!
And I thought, heaven help us if we ever become dependent on morality experts to tell us.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds like some kind of dystopian thing. I don't even want to think about that. No. And in fact, what I really like about my particular field in astrophysics is that there have been wonderful contributions made to it by lay people.
Right.
That this is one of the few scientific fields where lay people can and do get involved. And I've met people who had no formal scientific training who have remarkable scientific knowledge and are able to reason through these things and ask very intelligent questions,
right,
and to point out flaws in some of these models and things. And I think that that's wonderful, and people should do that.
Yeah.
And same for any other field, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so no, I reject that idea that you need experts. It's just that we are here to render a service because most people are too busy doing other important things to spend hours and hours reading through the literature and performing experiments.
finding out about black holes.
Right. Yeah.
Learning about black holes. This was great. And I have to stop, but I could go on for a couple of hours. I so appreciate your time. I've been a fan for a while, and I'm going to try not to gush, but
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you.
yeah. And so thank you. The book that you are part of about the cosmos,
The Story of the Cosmos.
the story of the cosmos, is so good. The pictures are gorgeous, even just for the pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They really went all out on that. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a stunning book. Can we talk again sometime?
Absolutely. I'd love to. I really enjoyed this.
Okay. Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
anytime. Thank you so much. You asked great questions.
It was great to meet you too. And we'll talk again. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.